Autism. Autism is a subject that may seem to be known, but this could not be any further from the truth that is being told. People claim that those with autism not only have an easy life, some may even say that those with autism aren't smart. These potential statements are false, and the fact is that life does not hand everything to those with autism, and that people who have autism have a lot more intelligence than people think. Hello, my name is Dakota Green, and welcome to my documentary, Life with Autism, where I'll be discussing with you, the viewer, about autism. Autism is a very complicated subject that has a knowledge gap that will continue to grow potentially as official diagnoses are continued to be made. And with questions such as, what is autism? And what impact does autism have on someone or other people? Could be asked without much confidence in an answer. Well, this documentary will seek to provide answers to as many questions as possible, while also providing as much important information as possible. This documentary will also discuss important parts about autism's history and facts that are necessary for a better understanding of autism. This will be followed by several interviews that have questions focusing on some potential areas of someone's life who has autism, including educational life, church life, social life, and even personal life. The sections that were previously discussed will also have a focus on my life and how autism has impacted various parts of my own life. This will conclude the introduction of this documentary, and now we can proceed to discuss the history and information of autism. Before we proceed, I would like to ask you to pay close attention to the information that this documentary provides so that you can close any potential knowledge gap you have about autism, so that way one day we can close that knowledge gap permanently. Without any further introduction, I once again present to you Life with Autism. Autism has quite the history in terms of length and the number of people who have caused the topic to become an interest of research. To begin, the history of autism dates back to the early 20th century, when it was first identified by Swiss psychiatrist Eugene Bleuler. He noticed that some of his patients exhibited a withdrawal from social interaction, a lack of interest in others, and an ability to communicate effectively. Do note that while autism was identified in the early 20th century, it was still not recognized as a distinct disorder that could be diagnosed. It wasn't until the 1940s that autism was recognized as a distinct disorder. In 1943, Leo Kanner, a child psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins University, published a paper describing a group of children who exhibited similar symptoms to those observed by Bleuler. Kanner was the one who coined the term early infantile autism to describe autism at that time. In the 1960s, researchers began to focus on the role of genetics in the development of autism, and in the 1980s, the diagnostic criteria for autism were revised, leading to an increase in the number of children diagnosed with the disorder. As a matter of fact, according to the CDC, the rate of autism has increased from 1 in 150 children in 2000 to an astounding 1 in 36 children in 2020. That was a brief but important history about autism and its origins. But before we continue, we need to discuss more information about autism, such as more information for diagnosis rates and symptoms of autism. One very important thing that must be discussed is the autism spectrum. However, the spectrum itself is difficult to explain visually, but I'm going to make an attempt to show you what the autism spectrum could look like in a visual standpoint. We can begin by drawing a simple line to represent the severity of a diagnosis and reading from left to right. We can call this dot here on the left people who need a very substantial amount of support. And these are those that may be unable to communicate or do things most other autistic people can perform. We can call this dot here in the center people who need substantial support. And these are those who can perform more than those that need very substantial support. But this does not mean that they are in no need of support. We can call this dot here on the right people who just need support and can be seen as normal people in society, such as myself. This proves the fact that even though people may think that those with autism have easy lives, that's not true at all. Autistic people, even those who are high functioning, need plenty of support from their peers and family throughout their lives. What I have mentioned previously is not meant to offend anyone. It is simply important information that is necessary for any given diagnosis of autism to be made. Now we can move on to some examples of symptoms that scientists, psychiatrists, and other professionals can use to make an official diagnosis. Social and communication skills are challenging for those with autism, and symptoms may include not sharing interests with others by 15 months of age, not noticing other children and joining them for play by 3 years of age, and not singing, dancing, or acting by 5 years of age. People with autism may also express unusual behaviors or interests, such as repeating words or phrases, getting upset at minor changes, flapping hands, rocking body, or spinning in circles, and having unusual reactions to the way that things sound, smell, taste, look, or feel. Some other characteristics may include delayed language, movement, cognition, or learning skills, hyperactive, impulsive, and or inattentive behavior, epilepsy or seizure disorder, unusual eating or sleeping habits, gastrointestinal issues, unusual mood or emotional reactions, anxiety, stress, or excessive worry, and lack of fear, or more fear than expected. We are nearly at the conclusion of this section, and I know there is a lot of information, but I believe it's necessary and it is important for a better understanding of what autism is. According to the CDC, since 2000, the prevalence of ASD, autism spectrum disorder, has increased steadily among all groups, but during the years of 2018 through 2020, the increases were greater for Black and Hispanic children than for white children. The CDC also claims this data indicates that ASD is common across all groups of children and underscore the considerable need for equitable and accessing screenings, services, and support for all children. Even though the knowledge gap could close some with the information given in this section, it's important that it needs to be understood. Otherwise, the knowledge gap will only continue to grow larger. And that's the reason why I challenged you and encouraged you earlier to understand and pay close attention to the information discussed throughout this documentary. This will conclude this part of the documentary, and as we move on to the next few sections consisting of interviews, I once again challenge you to keep some kind of understanding autism with the information provided. Now please, join me for the interviews that I was able to provide for this documentary and see what others think about me and my own autism. Education throughout my life has been a struggle to get through a lot of the time, especially for my elementary and middle school education. It just wasn't what I was taught, but it was bullying from others about my difference in personality, behavior, and overall knowledge of certain topics. However, even though the bullying and lack of understanding certain topics and ideas discouraged me, I had plenty of teachers and professors throughout it all that supported me 100% of the way. Teachers, such as my high school teachers Miss Crabtree and Miss Rose, and professors such as Russ Harper and Jesse Tipton, have all supported me despite my autism, causing troubles with understanding. There have also been others who have assisted me as well, and with that fact, I've had an opportunity to do some interviews with a few of my professors. We will begin by going to speak to our first interviewee and asking them some simple, open-minded questions. Hello, how are you doing today?
Doing fine, thank you.
Well, I'm just here today to simply ask you a few questions. I would like to start by asking you this first question. When you were in school, was autism known? And if not, how did people react to others with it?
When I was in school, no. I mean, when I was in elementary and high school, it was the 60s and 70s, and there wasn't, I mean, there, of course it existed, but we were ignorant of it. There was not, I mean, as far as my kid perception of the world, no, I was not aware. And when I was actually going to college here at Mississippi State, not so much. It was, I mean, of course it was known about, but it was not a thing that we were made very aware of.
Second question for you today is, as a professor, how many students have you seen in the past with autism, and what were your initial reactions?
I could not tell you how many, but it's been several, a lot. And my initial reaction varies. I mean, sometimes I think, oh, this is going to be a challenge. Sometimes I think, oh my God, can I even teach this person? And sometimes I'm thinking, wow, with that diagnosis, this person's brilliant and they're going to make an amazing student. So it's all over the place.
The third question I'll ask you today is, do you believe that people with autism have a massive disadvantage over those that don't in the education system, and why?
I think just like there is a spectrum of autism, from what I understand, I'm no expert whatsoever, not close. Uh, I think that a lot of times they do face an unfair disadvantage because they're stereotyped right away. I mean, even as I said, I've seen students where I wondered if I would be able to teach them, where, okay, this is possible, to I would never be able to tell if this person had any kind of issue at all. So I think just by putting the label on them, they are disadvantaged. Just by putting the label on them.
The fourth question I need to ask you is this. Have you ever witnessed any bullying of a student that has autism? And if so, how did you handle the situation?
I have seen bullying of a student who's autistic, and I handled it like I would handle any bullying situation. I will take the student aside and explain to him that that's not the way we behave in a classroom atmosphere setting, and we need to treat everybody with respect. Okay, we don't know what their story is. We don't know what their advantages or disadvantages are, so we need to treat everybody with respect.
My final question for you today is, do you believe that autism has a knowledge gap that is unrecognized by many, and why?
When you say knowledge gap, do you mean knowledge about autism or knowledge about, okay. I would say so. Just from my experience teaching, I would say there's a whole sea of misunderstanding that we still need to work on to figure it out.
Thank you so much for taking the time today to interview me, and you take care.
My pleasure, Dakota.
And with that, let's move on to our second interview for this section. Hello, how are you doing today?
I'm fine. How you doing?
Doing fine. I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak with you today, and I would just like to ask you some simple questions. So the first question I'd like to ask you is this. When you were in school, was autism known? And if not, how did others respond to it?
Well, when I went to school, there was not a lot of talk about autism or any kind of thing about neurotypical or anything of that nature. It just didn't come up.
My next question I'll be asking you today is this. As a professor, how many students in the past have you seen with autism, and what were your reactions?
Well, as I came to work here at Pellissippi State, I noticed that there were quite a few people in the class that were not neurotypical. And a lot of those folks did not go through disability services or anything like that. So I had to open my own mind enough to encompass this new group of people for me.
So, third question I'll ask you today is this. Do you believe that people with autism have a massive disadvantage over those that don't in the education system, and why?
Okay. Everybody's an individual. You can't paint everyone that is on the spectrum in any particular light. Everybody is an individual. Everybody has different levels of functionality, even neurotypical folks. So it's impossible to say a blanket statement like people with autism are at a disadvantage.
Fourth question I'm going to ask you today is this. Have you ever witnessed bullying of a student with autism? And if so, how would you handle the situation?
Well, sometimes bullying does happen in college, and we have to be on the lookout for that as instructors. So we would handle it just like we would any other type of bullying, where we can pull people aside and explain things to them. And if it becomes an issue, we can remove them from the classroom if necessary.
My final question for you today is this. Do you believe that autism has a knowledge gap that is unrecognized most of the time, and why?
Well, for the general population, I think there is a gap in people's knowledge about autism and about just the whole spectrum that we all live on. So I think a lot of folks don't recognize it, they don't understand it, and I think there needs to be a little bit more just opportunities for people to learn about it.
Thank you so much for your time today and answering these questions.
My pleasure, Dakota.
And with that, let's move on to our next interview for this section. Thank you for letting me have this opportunity to speak with you today. I'll only be asking you some simple questions. First question I'm going to ask you today is this. When you were in school, was autism known? And if not, how did people react to others diagnosed with it?
Thanks for having me. It's good to have this opportunity to talk about it. I don't remember autism ever being mentioned when I was in school. Maybe in high school, that's when we started noticing some people were maybe a little different than others, but I don't remember the word autism specifically being used when I was a high school student in the early to mid 2000s.
Second question I'll ask you is this. As a professor, how many students in the past did you see have autism besides myself, and what were your initial reactions?
So that's the thing is, unless I have a student register with Disability Services, I'm not really allowed to ask students if they have autism, and it's definitely not part of my icebreaker projects that we do at the beginning of each semester. I don't go around and say, my name is Jesse and I do not have autism.
Third question I'll ask you is this. Do you believe that people with autism have a massive disadvantage over those that don't in the education system, and why?
I think that everybody has their own unique set of challenges, whether it is people with color blindness, people with vision impairments, people with hearing disabilities, people with physical abnormalities maybe, and the same thing with autism. I think that people with autism can definitely have a set of weaknesses that maybe other people don't, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are overly disadvantaged compared to other people, because in some ways people with autism may have certain strengths over people who don't have autism.
I have another question after this, which will be the final one, but have you ever witnessed any bullying of a student with autism? And if so, how did you handle that situation?
I don't know that I have noticed any bullying towards students with autism. Since I've been teaching here at Pellissippi State, thankfully all the students have been very respectful to each other, and I notice more support for fellow students and among students than I do the opposite. I don't really notice a whole lot of bullying, thankfully. It seems like it just is a really good community of students here, and it seems that if students are having issues or difficulties, maybe due to autism, then I tend to see students support those autistic students more than I would see them tearing them down and making fun of them, thankfully.
Final question I have for you today is this. Do you believe that autism has a knowledge gap that's unrecognizable most of the time, and why?
So what do you mean by knowledge gap?
I mean a gap of understanding what it is.
In terms of other people understanding what autism is?
Yes.
Okay. I think that there is a knowledge gap in autism, and I'll say that just from a personal standpoint. I don't know the difference between varying levels of autism. Like, I don't understand quite what high-functioning autistic people are capable of or incapable of, and with that said, I don't know what people on the other end of the spectrum are not capable of.
Thank you so much again for taking time to interview today, and you take care of yourself.
All right. Same to you, Dakota.
And with this last interview, let's move on to the next section, church life. Religion is a big aspect of many lives, and despite my Christian faith, the many social interactions I've been faced with have been a great struggle. While it may seem like autism doesn't affect a person going to church, this isn't true, as certain noises within a church, such as a simple cough, could distract or create a sense of very temporary disorientation. However, I have been blessed with an opportunity to live stream for my church throughout a typical week and have met several great people that helped me even to this day. The problem for quite some time was finding a church I believed I belonged in. After dipping my foot in the waters of other churches, metaphorically of course, I finally found my church home at Highland Park Baptist Church. I have also been blessed with an opportunity to come here to speak to a few people at this church to ask them some questions about autism. So let's go talk to them, shall we? Hello, Michael. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy life to speak with me today. I just have a few simple questions. First question I ask you is, have you ever worked with anyone in the church that's had autism, and if so, what was the experience like?
Glad to be here, Dakota. Anything I can do to help give clear answers for these questions for you. Working here at church is it's kind of got a different role than what a lot of people would probably experience when you deal with individuals with autism. We have dealt with folks with autism from young ages with things as more severe that might be like Down syndrome, with things as mild as ADHD.
The next question I would like to ask you is this. When you grew up, do you recall a time where you've seen someone with autism, and could you remember what happened?
I've had a lot of crazy cool growing up experiences, and just seeing how people have been different has always been one of the big pluses of my childhood. Trying to recall after seeing some students in elementary school that had autism, I didn't know what might have been different or what might have been different for me.
My final question for you today is this. How did people respond to those with autism back before an official diagnosis was made?
Dakota, I'm glad you asked that. Growing up, one of the biggest things that we have always learned going through school and going through middle school rather, and high school age brackets and stuff like that is that you're never ever going to understand that two people are alike. Even twins are drastically different.
Thank you so much for the time to interview me today, Michael.
You're welcome, Dakota.
And with that, we can move on to our next interview. Hey, I'm so glad you could make it here today. And don't worry, just have a few simple questions, no wrong answers. So, the first question I'd like to ask you today is this. Have you ever worked with anyone in the church who has autism, and what was the experience like?
Not in the church. I've worked with Dakota in the church, but I've known and been around several people with autism, and there's different levels of autism that people have.
The next question I would like to ask you today is this. When you grew up, do you recall a time where you've seen someone with autism, and could you remember what happened?
Not really. They vaguely, maybe a time or two, and it wasn't good scene because the autism, they were extreme, and their actions were not too good.
My final question for you today is this. How did people respond to those with autism back before an official diagnosis was made?
Back years ago, people didn't respond to people with autism very well. They tended to put them away and just not deal with them.
Hey, thanks, man, for taking the time to speak with me today, and you take care.
Okay, Dakota, thank you.
And with that, let's move on to the next interview for this section. Thank you so much for taking time to speak today, and I figure with the number of people who provide transportation with on the bus, you could answer these simple questions. And with that, the first question I want to ask you today is, have you ever worked with people who have autism in the church? And if so, what was the experience like?
Well, first of all, Dakota, thank you for letting me speak today with you and answering your questions. To answer your question, I also worked in the school system prior to being here at the church and working with some of the kids. Autism to me is, I look at it many different ways, but I've dealt with kids with autism and never even knew it.
The next question I need to ask you today is this. When you grew up, do you recall a time where you've seen someone with autism, and could you remember what happened?
It's hard to say. Like I said before, for the first question, once when I was younger, I guess you'd see kids act different, and you would in the back of your mind you would wonder why is that kid doing that, or why is their mother not jumping on them, why are they not getting in trouble.
Final question I must ask you today is this. How did people respond to those with autism back before an official diagnosis was announced?
I think that speaking of a school standpoint, say, in school, being a kid in school, I see jealousy come into play. I've seen jealousy from other kids, from the student that may have autism. He had better grades. He never would take a book home. He was smarter. Never could figure that out.
Thank you so much for taking the time today. You take care.
No problem, Coach. Thank you.
And with that, we are prepared to move on to the final interview for this section. Hey Eddie, it's great to have an opportunity to speak with you today, and with your experience of preaching at different churches, questions should be quite simple to answer. With that being said, the first question I have for you today is this. Have you ever worked with people who have autism in the church? And if so, what was the experience like?
Well, I just remembered when we were talking years ago, I helped start a special needs class at Sunday school class, and I had two children in it with autism, and we were able to not only teach them in Sunday school, but we were able to put on a couple of programs in church, teaching them Bible stories and different things, and it was a really good experience teaching Sunday school with them.
Next question I have for you today is this. When you grew up, do you recall a time where you've seen someone with autism, and could you remember what happened?
Well, I can remember seeing kids with autism. My wife used to work in a class with them, and I was there. But growing up, I didn't see that many kids with autism. We had a friend who had a son with autism, and we used to go there, and I used to help him. He liked to count his quarters, and I used to sit on the floor with him and help count his quarters.
The final question I have for you today is this. How did people respond to those with autism back before an official diagnosis was announced?
Back then, a lot of people didn't know what was causing it. There wasn't a lot of medication for it, and I think a lot of times that the children were just looked at it just being different than everybody else, instead of it just accepting them the way they are, the way we do today.
Thank you so much for taking this time
Thank
to speak
you, Dakota.
with me today.
You're a good young man. I appreciate you.
Oh, that's no problem. And with that final interview, we can move on to our next section. Growing up, my social life was quite complicated for me, including a lack of social cues and friends. Most people did not understand how truly different I was, and those who acted like they did treated me with disrespect and bullied me. only acting like they were my friend to have an available excuse if they were to get in trouble. Even to this very day, the concept of hanging out with friends is not something I can understand, unlike many of my peers, and throughout my life, this has caused me to often be depressed. While this may sound like I am still friendless, that is not the case. And as a matter of fact, I have a few very close friends that I can some way or somehow always talk to. That is why a couple of my close friends have agreed to do an interview so that you could get a better insight of the kinds of people I am close friends with. Hey, Addison, thanks for coming out here today so I can ask you some questions. Don't worry, just a few simple, open-minded questions. Go ahead and take you a seat. And first question I'm going to ask you today is this. Before we became friends, did you know, still know, or meet anyone who has or had autism?
Yes, I actually had a friend in third grade, and I honestly did not even know that she had autism until we got older. And one, we had talked about it, and another thing that she did have like sensory issues. But to this day, we are still friends, just like me and you.
Second question I'm going to ask you today is this. Do you believe that people with autism having struggles with social cues are a problem, and why?
I do not think that they specifically are a problem, but social cues are very, very important. And not being able to go about the situation can put you yourself or someone with autism in a difficult position just because how other people react.
Third question I have for you today is this. What was your initial reaction to when I informed you about me having autism?
Well, I was informed a little before I had met you. So at first, my mom, kind of grilled me out. And she was like, you better be nice. And so at first, I tried to, be cautious around you until, I actually knew you. And I was like, wow, you kind of don't want to be treated like that, like there's anything, you know. And that was basically what it was.
Final question I'm going to ask you today is this. If you found out that another friend of yours had autism and never brought it up, would you still be their friend?
Yes, because they were my friend in the first place because of who they are, not any condition that they have. I don't view autism as a reason to not be someone's friend. That's kind of really ridiculous.
Thank you for coming out to talk today. And we'll hang out soon, yeah?
Oh, yeah, a bit.
With that, let's move on to our other interview for this section. Hey, Tommy, it's great to see you, and I know you're my brother's best friend as well, but I also appreciate the friendship we have as well. So, take some time, talk for me to ask you some simple questions, and with that, first question I need to ask you is this. Before we became friends, did you know, still know, or meet anyone who has or had autism?
Well, we had a very close family friend who would probably be my first experience with autism, right? I can't remember his name. I knew him when I was very young, but he was a little bit older than me, and we went to church together a lot. And we just became pretty close.
Second question I need to ask you today is this. Do you believe that people with autism having struggles with social cues are a problem, and why?
Well, I feel like it's a problem for the person affected by it mostly, because other people aren't as good at being aware or accommodating for those things, right? And I feel like people should be more educated on it.
Third question I need to ask you today is this. What was your initial reaction to when I informed you about me having autism?
Well, I've always been fairly educated on autism. My mom always taught me about it because we have family members and friends who have autism, so I never really viewed you any differently. I always tried to be patient, you know.
Final question I need to ask you today is this. If you found out that another friend of yours had autism and never brought it up, would you still be their friend?
I would still be their friend. I don't think it would change our relationship in any meaningful way. I'd still see them the same way. If anything, I'd probably be more upset that they felt that they couldn't share something like that with me, you know. But no, I'd still be their friend.
Hey, thanks for coming out today to speak. Oh,
Thank you.
hey, we'll hang out real soon, yeah?
It was fun.
With that, let's move on to the final section of this documentary. I would like to end this documentary with discussing with you all parts of my own personal life. Now, of course, this will exclude any private details, but let's talk about it. Let's talk about some of my personal life. When I am alone or at home, I feel at ease and at a place where I can express myself a lot more. Some things I love to do include playing video games, using my PC to play games and do work on my own personal projects such as imaginary games. I believe I work on and running an imaginary streaming channel. Hello chat, welcome to the stream. We've got some things in store for today. We're gonna play some games, all that wouldn't matter. And listening to plenty of music, but namely video game music. My personal life wouldn't be complete without a family who has raised me to handle my personality and behavior. So I was able to get in touch with some of my closest family so that I can do a few interviews with them for our final section of this documentary. Come in. Hey, Kendra. Glad you could come over. Just simple discussion we're having.
Okay.
A few simple questions. Go ahead and make yourself comfortable. First question I need to ask you today is this. When you found out that I had autism, can you briefly discuss your reaction to the news?
Well, when I found out you had autism, I was only 6 years old, I believe. But whenever I was old enough to realize what it was, I really didn't have a reaction. I just looked at you the same. It wasn't any different.
Second question I need to ask you is this. Before you found out about me having autism, did you know anyone who had autism or had any experience with it?
I did not.
None whatsoever. Well.
No, I was so young.
Third question I need to ask you is this. If you could describe in 2 good sentences how my autism has impacted you, what would they be?
I think that they have impacted me. They've taught me what autism is. They have impacted me in a positive and a negative way.
Final question I need to ask you is this. Do you believe that my autism has affected my personal, social, and educational life?
I do. Your social life, I think it has made it harder for you to socialize, make friends. Education, I don't think so a bit. You're extremely smart. You've done great all through your life in school. Your personal life, yes, I think it has. Kind of in the same way as your social life, it's made it harder for you to connect with people and to kind of live, a semi-normal life. It's made it a little harder.
Thank you again for coming over today.
You're welcome.
And I'll talk to you later.
Okay, I love you.
Love you too. And with that, let's move on to our next interview. Come in. Hey, Gage, thanks for taking time to come speak with me today, and I know you've been busy with college. So, just going to ask you a few simple questions. Go ahead and make yourself comfortable. Okay, so, first question I'm going to ask you is this. When you found out that I had autism, can you briefly discuss your reaction to the news?
So I'd like to say that I was a bit surprised to hear it, but since I was younger, I was mainly focused on arguing with you since you were my brother, but I tried my best to make accommodations and make sure I wasn't being too much on you as well.
Second question I'm going to ask you today is this. Before you found out about me having autism, did you know anyone who had autism or had any experience with it?
Since you're my brother, you were the first person I was exposed to with autism, so you were the first that I was introduced to.
Third question I'm going to ask you is this. If you could describe in 2 good sentences how my autism has impacted to you, what would they be?
Alright, so for my first sentence, I try my best to stick up for you and protect you when I can. And you've also helped me grow as a person a lot and mature a lot faster than I would have.
Final question I'm going to ask you today is this. Do you believe that my autism has affected my personal, social, and educational life?
I would say yes, since the stories you have told me about your school experiences with teachers, I believe that you have been discriminated against and they haven't accommodated you enough for your autism. And even in your personal life, I believe that it has been impacted by your autism as well.
I appreciate you once again taking time to interview with me today, and I hope college continues to be good for you.
Thank you.
With that, let's move on to our final 2 interviews for this documentary. Come in. Hey, Dad, thanks for coming over. So we can talk about some things.
All right.
Be some few simple questions, so go ahead and take a seat. We'll begin. First question I'll ask you today is this. When you found out I had autism, can you briefly discuss your reaction to the news?
Well, just was worried about it. Didn't know much about it.
Second question I'll ask you today is this. Before you found out about me having autism, did you know anyone else who had autism or have any experience with it?
No, really, I hadn't. Never heard much about it when I was growing up, so didn't know anybody really that had it.
Third question I'll ask today is this. If you could describe in 2 good sentences how my autism has impacted you, what would they be?
Well, just it's opened my eyes up to it more. I know more about it now.
Fourth question I'll ask you today is this. Do you believe that my autism has affected my personal, social, and educational life?
Yeah, some it has. You've dealt with it well, more when you was younger than as you've gotten older, I think. But for the most part, you adjusted and done well, really.
Come in. Hey, Mom. Thanks for coming today so I can ask you some questions. They're simple, but I believe they're important to ask, so go ahead and take your seat and we'll get started. First question I'll be asking you today is this. When you found out I had autism, can you briefly discuss your reaction to the news?
Well, as a mother, I don't know, call it mother's intuition or whatever you will. When the moment I laid eyes on you, I knew you had autism. But when you were officially diagnosed, I was hoping I was wrong, so it really upset me because I knew that things were going to be harder for you, and kids these days are really mean. I was afraid you'd get bullied, so it did upset me.
Second question I'll be asking you today is this. Before you found out about me having autism, did you know anyone else who had autism or have any experience with it?
Not personally. I knew of a little boy that had autism that went to my mama's church, and I heard a lot of stories about him, but I did not personally know anyone, no.
Third question I'll be asking you today is this. If you could describe in 2 sentences how my autism has impacted you, what would they be?
Oh, I get a lot of laughs out of you. You're very funny even when you don't mean to be. And I think it's also made me stronger as a parent and as a person in general. Just to learning with you and learning how to keep you calm when you have your moments and just learning how to be there for you.
Fourth question I'll be asking you today is this. Do you believe that my autism has affected my personal, social, and educational life?
Your education, I think it was a good thing because you're so smart and do well at everything you do. Your social and personal life, honestly, I think it probably affected you in a more negative way because you have a hard time with social cues and making friends and things like that.
I have one last question to ask you. Would you have it any other way?
No.
Why not?
No, I wouldn't, because you wouldn't be the man you are today.
I love you.
Love you too, boy.
I have one last question to ask you.
Yes.
It's really simple. Would you have it any other way?
Absolutely
and
not.
why not?
Absolutely not, baby. Autism is what makes you you, and I wouldn't have you any other way because this is the way God created you. I love you.